Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Prof Weekly Show. And today we are so excited to be joined by MJ Gallagher, author of so many books of exploring Final Fantasy lore, Final Fantasy VII. In fact, I've got a couple of the books right here.
Show them off.
We've got the Norse myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII, and we've got the Greek myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII. And
I've brought a copy as well.
Yes, twins.
I even have a really up to date little thing.
Oh,
really,
got the.
really up to date.
And I should say that part of the excitement of having MJ on today is the upcoming, very anticipated release of Mythos. Now, do you say Mythos or Mythos? How do you do it?
Usually when I say Mythos, but
Mythos?
I'm also very, very excited to, every time I do get to say Mythos, actually slip into, a Mythos.
Exactly. You got to draw it out,
really chew on it.
Really let the people enjoy it. And so we're really, really excited about the upcoming book Mythos, which is an exploration of Final Fantasy XVI, cycles of life and death and rebirth, which is really, really cool. I've even got my Phoenix, my Joshua shirt on today to celebrate and commemorate the day. MJ, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. Hugely appreciate it. I've been dipping in and out of the past episodes that you've released so far, and it's so entertaining. I've really enjoyed listening to you guys and your different perspectives on things. And more recently, just as part of my refamiliarizing myself with certain elements of Final Fantasy XVI, I went back and listened to our previous show together that we did for the Echoes of the Fallen DLC, and I sort of blew my mind all over again. Just our conversation.
It was such a good conversation. I go back to that again and again. It is so good.
So I just absolutely adore talking about Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy VII and 16 in particular, and I am thrilled to be here. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, we are delighted, and we're going to get into it. We've got a lot of things that we want to cover. We especially want to let everybody in the listening audience know that you can still pre-order Final Fantasy XVI Mythos by MJ Gallagher. Join the Kickstarter. We'll have all the links in the comments and the show notes below. But it's been a pretty successful Kickstarter, hasn't it?
It has. I've been so lucky. This is the second Kickstarter that I've run, and in advance you're always really quite apprehensive about how it's going to go. You can never really gauge audience levels. So this one, we managed to hit the target within or just under 15 minutes, which was sensational. And as of today, we're sitting at something like 650% funded. So it's one of the biggest pats on the back you can ever hope to receive as a content creator. Just that people are not only willing to consume the content that you're putting out there, but they're up front they're willing to put their money down. So I'm so grateful to everyone that's backed, including yourself, Wade. And I'm just touched that people are interested in the things that I've got to say. Final Fantasy and mythology are just two of the biggest passions in my life. Yeah. So having the opportunity to sort of sit and write them down and help to enrich other people's experience of these games is just a dream come true for me. So I'm so grateful to be in this position.
Well, let me tell you, like the information is so good in these books, but you carry it. The way that you're able to articulate, the way that you are able to interact with people that are interested, whether it's on social media or in interviews like this, people invest and believe in the books because they invest and believe in you. And it has been a delight to get to know you over these last couple of years. And I'm just excited to get into it again today. So thank you for being here.
Extraordinarily kind of you to say. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, let's get into it a little bit. We want to know a little bit about the writer behind the writing.
Yes.
We would love to know kind of your own origin story, and I guess a gaming origin story. What was the first game that really like captivated you? The one that you got lost in?
Weirdly enough, the first time I sort of grew up in the era where, when I was really starting to notice video games and actively want to play video games. It was like the Sega Mega Drive or the SNES, or you guys called it the Super Nintendo as well, didn't you?
Yeah, Super
Yeah.
Nintendo SNES has become like the colloquial thing, but yeah.
Okay, cool. So that was the kind of generation where when I was a kid, those were the big things, and it was like Sonic the Hedgehog 2 was the first game that I ever owned, and just it was so exciting, just being able to sort of move at that speed. And I loved, like Mario 3 or Super Mario World with Yoshi and things like that. But
So good.
my kind of early experience of gaming was like platformers like that. Maybe moving on to like sports games, soccer games, or Crash Bandicoot things. The first time that I ever experienced a game that really made me sit up and realize that this medium was different to just, sit down for half an hour and mess around, and that was it. You didn't have to think about it after that kind of thing. But the first time I ever got to a game that gripped me was actually Final Fantasy VII. So it sort of came along. When the game released in the UK, I had just turned 12, and I had a brief shot of it round about Christmas time when it launched, but didn't actually own the game for maybe another 6 months. But by this point, I'd taken an interest. I'd never seen anything remotely like it. All of us know how breathtaking the visuals were, the storytelling, how profound an impact it had on us growing up. So I don't tell you guys about that, but some of the stories that you've shared in the past, I totally resonate with that. That's how it impacted me. And even today, some of my philosophies on life are quite in sync with that game. My view on environmentalism, capitalism, spiritualism. It's. I think a lot of it was heavily influenced by Final Fantasy VII, and to a lesser extent, Final Fantasy VIII as well. So not only as an adult and sort of what I do in my sort of creative life now was heavily influenced by Final Fantasy VII, but my actual broader day to day, how I want to go about living my life, how I view the world, is actually quite nicely tied in. That's how profound an impact it had on me.
And it clearly continues to. I mean, from 1997 to today, you've written Norse myths, now Greek myths on Final Fantasy VII. You also tell me about the Nibelheim incident. That's another book that you wrote, contributed. Tell me a little bit about that. I actually don't know much about it.
Okay, so when I was a kid, as I kind of said to you off air, my dad is or he was a math teacher. He's retired now, and I just had sort of one of those minds. I've always had a very kind of logic based, brain. So growing up, that was the sort of arena that I felt most comfortable in. Not writing, not kind of literary analysis, things like that. That was outside of what I was comfortable with. And when I was about 15, I, as part of a homework assignment one day, decided to actually write down what I was playing, which happened to be the Rocket Town scenario in Final Fantasy VII. I just sort of, wrote down meeting Sid, the dialogue there, the sort of the emotions that were going on. And sort of handed that in as a piece of homework and realized that I really enjoyed it. So I ended up going back and actually putting together like a really I want to say rough. I mean, it was worse than rough. It was handwritten. I recently found the original handwritten version. But yeah, it was a handwritten novelized version of Final Fantasy VII. And over the years, I just sort of put it together, and eventually, shared some of it online, and it got a bit of interest, and I converted it into a couple of sort of effectively just fan fiction novels, And round about the time of publishing the second volume, which goes up to Cosmo Canyon, I got kind of started getting to know the organisers of KupoCon a little bit better, and they invited me along to their first UK event because.
So just real quick for everybody listening, KupoCon is essentially a Final Fantasy fan convention, in the UK, right? Is that where it's based, or is it?
It's the lead organizer is actually based in Canada.
Okay.
The events typically go between North America and the UK.
Okay.
They are looking to sort of spread out to go to Australia and things like that, but the events so far have been Canada, US, and UK specifically. Cool. But when we kind of first started speaking, what they wanted to do is have gift items available for like VIP ticket holders. So they decided that they were going to give away 100 copies of my first novel, my first sort of Final Fantasy VII novelization, and have me on site to sign these things. And for me, that was the biggest thing that ever happened, kind of thing.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So I was so excited about that. And that was we're going back to 2016, I think that was. And the following event in the UK, they did the same thing for my second volume in my novelization. And afterwards, we sort of had a conversation and thought, you know what, rather than focus on what I'd already produced, why not create something exclusively for the convention, which is how the Nibelheim incident came into existence. So I took a chunk of the Final Fantasy VII novelization I'd already written and then expanded on it to basically put together a kind of a coherent version or a coherent retelling of the Nibelheim incident, because those of us familiar with the compilation will know that there's not actually one standard version of it. The version from the original game is different to Crisis Core, which is different to Before Crisis, and there's little pieces of Last Order in there and so on and so forth. So what I did was take as much information from the various titles as I could and put it together in one story. And I had a good friend of mine, an Australian artist known as Crimson Sun. Crimson Sun's they're kind of known more so for like a comic book style. So they provided the interior artwork for it as well, and we produced it for KupoCon, and it just took off. It was really, really well received. I eventually kind of won awards for it within the Final Fantasy community, just as a sort of content creator piece. And the following year, ended up co-authoring a Final Fantasy VIII novel with an American author called Micah Rodney. And by that point, I'd released 4 different books. I had been kind of working on a couple other projects, and it was just a labour of love. And I got to do some amazing things. Be taken over to New York, go over to Toronto to do signings and special guest events and stuff like that. And I realised that this is actually something that I really want to progress and see where I can take it. And that was kind of weird when I decided that I was going to sort of look at something that I could produce that could maybe look at things from a different angle, that could maybe help educate others, rather than just the sort of fiction perspective. That's when the mythology books sort of came into existence.
Could you talk a little bit about what it was like to transition from writing for fun and because you loved it and because it was something that you just liked to starting to have it featured at like a conference and creating a product that you can sell. Like, was there a switch that flipped? Was there a moment where you thought, wow, I could actually do this and this could be a big part of kind of what I do in my future? We have a lot of listeners who love to create and write, and so that's a big emphasis, some of the stuff that we talk about. What was that process like for you internally?
It was pretty mind-blowing, and even now, almost a decade later, I still have to pinch myself that this has even happened, or it continues to happen. I think I was just really excited, and it never ceases to amaze me that people are interested in what I do, because my secret has always been to write the things that I want to write about and things that I enjoy doing, and if there's an audience for it, then fantastic, and if not, then I had fun while I was doing it.
Cool.
And I think that's probably true for a lot of content creation, that I think so many people worry about what their audience is looking for rather than creating what they're passionate about, and allowing the audience to come to them because of that passion, because of that enthusiasm, because of that level of expertise in whichever sort of niche corner that they want to sort of carve out for themselves. So when it first really got going, I was just incredibly excited, incredibly grateful to be invited to something like that, where my books were, I'd already made them available sort of publicly. The novelization stuff, it was not something that was ever made, or it was never sold. It was always something that was just sort of made available for download, or if individuals wanted to print it themselves, they would just give them the files and they could go off and do it, sort of thing. So there was no sort of financial gain in it, which I was perfectly happy with. I just really kind of liked that other people were reading what I was producing.
Yeah, of course.
But the first event kind of changed that a little bit, where I was now kind of put face to face with the people that were reading my book, and it wasn't just a case of sort of handing over the book and saying, I hope you enjoy it. It turned out that quite a lot of them already had
that's so
online,
cool.
because it had been available for a while.
Yeah.
So I could have conversations about how they enjoyed it, what if there was any critiques that they had, so just to be able to speak to someone and have a kind of face-to-face conversation with someone who had already consumed your work and received it well and was praising you for it, that was kind of new to me. But I really enjoyed it, and while this was going on, sitting next to actors from Final Fantasy XV, like we had Ray Chase, who's
oh my gosh,
Noctis, and
Dream,
Lee, who is Libertus, and John Campling, who plays King Regis as well in Kingsglaive. So the four of us together were, for me, it was really bizarre being on that side of the table.
I bet.
And Libertus did the audiobook for, was it Greek Myths?
Yeah, so he actually did the audiobook for the Nibelheim incident as well.
Oh, okay, I didn't realize that. Nice.
Yeah, so that was produced through KuppelCon. So Liam and I've, as a result of sort of our being part of the sort of KuppelCon scene for several years, he and I became pretty good friends, which is where that came from. And I think having had a taste of that, even just for one day, gave me the encouragement to go away and do something different. And every time we did it, if we released the Nibelheim incident, for example, that was something totally different. Or going, international and presenting the book in Toronto, presenting the book in New York, like it's a totally different environment, and just to sort of feel like a minor celebrity for a day, it really kind of it gives the old ego, a nice little boost. And I think that's what it was to really go back, and I realise I've gone in a big circle here, but to answer your question, I think that was it, to actually get that acknowledgement face to face,
Yeah.
and the excitement of all that is what really kind of prompted me to move forward.
It sounds like you took a lot of little steps that were things that you wanted to do along the way, and it just kind of gradually built into bigger and bigger opportunities, as I would imagine your skills kind of developed at the same time as you built relationships. And I think that's everybody's looking for that aha moment a lot of the time, but the consistent work pursuing things that you are passionate about and have a skill set for sounds like a really great encouragement for those who are doing that. Now, I know that you've said that you were a writer before. You were, let me make sure I get this right, a cultural and historical tour writer, which you said has kind of contributed to your appreciation and interest in mythologies. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that is.
Sure,
and as we kind of transition into some of your work here with this new book that's coming out in Final Fantasy XVI. So what is a cultural and historical tour writer? What on earth did you do, and how did it contribute to this newest project that you have coming up?
Sure, yeah. So I'm obviously from Scotland, but when I was in my mid-20s, decided to sort of travel around the world for a while, and I settled down in, believe it or not, it was a haunted prison, sort of a tourist attraction, haunted prison.
Time out. Okay. An allegedly haunted prison, or you can confirm that this prison
Do
was
you have
haunted?
stories?
Yeah.
I do not personally have any stories.
Oh, okay.
What I
That you can
confirm
tell.
is that my bedroom at the prison has featured on Ghost Hunter International.
Okay, now bedroom or cell?
Cell.
It was a cell? You lived in a prison cell?
Yeah, so it was the prison itself had closed maybe 15 years earlier, but it was a heritage building, so it was kept open as a tourist attraction. So the staff that worked on site, most of them were backpackers
And ghosts.
So they and ghosts, yeah. Well, funny you should say that. There was actually a graveyard outside my bedroom.
Stop it!
But
What is this lore that we're dropping right now?
This is amazing.
So the backpackers would kind of come and maybe stay for 6 weeks, a couple of months, etc. And it was just work for your accommodation. So some people would clean, some people would work in the reception, others would be tour guides. So the tour guide aspect is what I went to do. And I showed up on the first day, and it turned out that the couple who owned the tourist attraction at the prison, the husband was, quite high up in the Maori councils, a really well respected family, and his wife was from Glasgow as well, which is Glasgow being my home city. So she and I just hit it off immediately, and after a conversation, I sort of told her that I'd been writing for years and years on the kind of Final Fantasy stuff. So she offered me a position of, rather than continuing to be a tour guide at the prison, would I be interested in her other business, which was basically like an audio tour for cruise ship passengers. So on the cruise ship, they would purchase the little MP3 device.
Yeah.
And they would get off the ship and sort of walk around with a little map and, listening to the history of the location, or the history of a building or a landmark or a particular area, all within walking distance of, either the harbour or the drop-off point. So my job was to visit the locations, to learn about the locations, to then write the tours and oversee the production of them.
That is so cool.
This is the coolest origin story I've ever heard. Oh my gosh.
So
Who
that
knew?
was that was my job for a number of years. I got to travel all around New Zealand, the east coast of Australia, all over the US.
Oh my gosh.
Sort of British Columbia, all over the Mediterranean, all over the Baltic. So I had quite an exciting job for a while. And one of the one of the really interesting things about it is just the format of the tours was, I would go away and I would learn about the region itself and the history of the region and the history of the sort of indigenous people, and then, the same thing about particular landmarks, so we'd find something that was, something that represented the sort of indigenous history, something that perhaps represented wartime, something that represented, urban legends, something that represented sort of important local figures and stuff like that, and just sort of interweave all the stories together. And it was through this that I started to get a real appreciation for local cultures all over the world.
I bet.
Sure.
And the folklore, the mythology that sort of came with some of the older cultures that had been there, in ancient times, or were still there, and their ancestors were still around, and that absolutely fascinated me. But there were two things that fascinated me even more about that. The first was how closely you could compare them. And that was my first real introduction to the field of comparative mythology.
Yeah.
And the second was how many things I recognized from world mythology that I had already found in Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
And that was always in the back of my mind of, I recognize these things. This gives me a greater appreciation for the games that I've played before.
Yeah.
And eventually I kind of just started, I just had this real desire, this need to kind of share that with others, and started writing blog posts about it. And eventually I had so much content available that I thought, okay, I'm just going to stick it in a book.
Yeah. That's so good. Now, just real quickly, very briefly, what is comparative mythology, like in one or two sentences? Just for the viewers. Not for me. Definitely not for me.
Comparative mythology is the recognition that there are archetypes or similar character types, similar tales that appear, which are kind of universal to the human experience. So while you might find, perhaps the most obvious one is the Chaos Camp story, which is all about a kind of cult hero, or quite often a storm god taking on a monster that represents chaos, quite often in a sort of serpentine form. And you see this in various different mythologies. Perhaps in Norse mythology, you see that through Thor and Jormungandr. In Greek mythology, you see it in the tale of Zeus versus Typhon. And, it goes on and on and on and on. So you basically, you see similar tales play out. The characters are different, the details are different, but they are the same universal myth that appear time and again across.
And to that same point, Evan, like in Hebrew mythology, early Christian mythology, Mesopotamian, Babylonian, Chaos Conf is broad-reaching since the beginning of time. And so these kind of archetypal mythologies that you're talking about, they are everywhere, and we find them certainly in Final Fantasy, which is phenomenal.
That's what I was going to say.
Thanks for that explanation.
That's a perfect... You guys are just like flies to the trap for Final Fantasy is perfect for you guys then. Well, Wade, I know you have a lot of questions about the new book and how it relates to Final Fantasy XVI. And so I'm going to find out everything I can about this ghost prison offline, but I'll let you...
Absolutely. So, I think that story, your origin story of how you got to where you are and became who you are, how you became MJ Gallagher of Final Fantasy VII book fame, right? This says so much about your process, because it strikes me that as you're talking, you were already kind of like a cultural archaeologist, deep diving in cultures that you were already seeing, helping people experience the tours as their guide. And now you're doing this with video games as well. Shifting gears to Final Fantasy XVI, you didn't set out when you began Final Fantasy XVI to write a book about it, correct? Like you
Um,
certainly maybe a thought, but
yeah, I certainly wouldn't say that I definitively set out, but by that point, I was nearing the completion of my Greek myths in Final Fantasy VII book, and knew that there was a real possibility that if Final Fantasy XVI was heavy on mythology,
yeah.
that might be something I would consider doing. And by the end of the demo, I knew
You knew. Yeah.
Demo, you didn't even have
this
to
was happening. So
It's a good demo. It's a really
it was
good demo.
so rich in content. Yeah.
So you're playing through 16 for the first time, and you're visiting all of these places. You're meeting these kind of priestly summoner archetypes that are becoming these divine beings. What was a moment that you said, "Oh, we have got something here"? Maybe it was in the demo, but when were you like, "Oh, this is a major work that I'm willing to step into"?
Um, the place that and I'm, hand on heart, I am being genuine that it was by the end of the demo I knew I was going to write something, but the place that I recognized that there was almost certainly going to be at least one book's worth of content here was by the time we get to Lost Wing. So really, really early in the game. And the reason for that is because I'd been writing my Greek mythology book, I was already had one of the chapters in that book is dedicated to the Phoenix, the sort of Phoenix materia that appears in Final Fantasy VII and Crisis Core. And the I'll try and keep this brief, right? So basically, there were two things that I knew for absolute certain that I was going to be looking at. The first one was the Phoenix. The second one was Dionysus. And the Phoenix itself is, while it is quite often associated with Greek mythology, it's not necessarily Greek in origin. Historians believe that it derived from the ancient Egyptian myth of the Bennu bird, which was the first being to exist in the Heliopolis version of the creation myth, which the Bennu bird is a kind of phoenix-like being that is closely associated with sort of being a bringer of life. But that's where Benumir comes from in Final Fantasy XVI.
And for our Final Fantasy XIV followers and fans, when you were in the Binding Coil of Bahamut fighting Phoenix, some of the adds, the additional enemies that show up are the Bennu birds. And this is a great mythological link for why that happens. I know that 14 is big right now, and those playing Binding Coil, you'll see that.
Absolutely. So, associating the Phoenix with the Bennu bird brings us to Heliopolis, and the original Phoenix myth that was written down in the 6th century BC actually very, very, very closely connects the Phoenix to Heliopolis, which was the Greek name for, oh goodness me, I've forgotten the name of the city, but it was basically where the sun god Ra was worshipped. So Helios is the ancient Greek god for the sun, and Ra is iconic within ancient Greek mythology as being representative of the sun, but he would travel across the sky every day in his sunboat. And one of the kind of core points of worship for Ra were obelisks. And that's kind of why the obelisk ended up being used as a sundial quite then. But it was actually a sort of place of worship. for the sun god. So in Final Fantasy 16, obviously you've got Joshua, you've got the Phoenix, the Phoenix association, with resurrection, without even going into the sort of associations with Jesus Christ and all that stuff.
Yep.
When we get to the sort of waypoints in Final Fantasy 16, they're called obelisks, which connect to the sky. It's also in the context of a fallen airship. And this is where they have the conversation about the airships that used to be in the sky. So the bigger context, which unravels over the course of the game, is how the Phoenix and Bennu and obelisks and the sunboats, which is just the fallen airships going across the sky. It's, you've got so much tied in together. From the Dionysus mythology, Dionysus is one of the sons of Zeus, who became an Olympian eventually. He represents overcoming death. So not specifically rebirth, but actually conquering death. He's known as the.
Can I ask a question? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
What's the difference between rebirth and conquering death? Like, you said that in a casual way, and I just wonder what you would say the distinction is in this mythological context.
Okay. Sorry. Fair enough.
That's my job. My job is to center. You just keep going. This is great.
Okay. So in ancient Greece, there were two main rites that were carried out, or festivals that were carried out each year with respect to the harvest. And the first one was the harvesting of grain, and that related to Demeter and Persephone, and that the celebration of harvesting grain as part of their ritual, they kind of retold the myth of Persephone being captured or kidnapped by Hades. And Demeter, who is the goddess of the seasons, basically just abandoned her post and went looking for Persephone. And eventually, the crops withered, and it was a kind of perpetual winter, and Zeus had to intervene and asked Hades to return Persephone. And Persephone, who would return to the upper world for 6 months of the year and then go back to Hades for 6 months of the year. And that cycle...
Joint custody. We have that in the States.
So, so this cycle was when Persephone would come out of the underworld, that would be spring and the flowers would bloom and crops could be planted and we would move into summer, and then eventually Persephone would return to the underworld, so the crops would be harvested, the land would begin to wither, we would get into winter, and then the cycle would begin again. So that process, that continuous process of sort of birth, life, death, rebirth, was very closely associated with the harvesting of crops every year. So when the myths associated with Dionysus came along, that was more to do with the harvesting of grapes. But the myth associated with Dionysus was actually that he was able to, depending on which sort of myth cycle you're talking about, the original one was that he became so powerful that he descended to the underworld, collected the soul of his mother, and then took her to the upper world. So he was able to overcome death in the underworld and take his mother up. But the point of that story was that where the individuals who worshipped Demeter would believe in this cycle of life, death, rebirth, they also believed in something close to reincarnation, where souls could go into the underworld and relinquish their memories and then effectively be reborn into the world as someone else. In the Dionysian myths, the idea was that you would become so knowledgeable about death and life that by the time you reached the underworld, you would know the secrets of how to have an eternal life, or how to have an eternal afterlife. So the difference there was one was a cycle and one was an eternal afterlife,
right?
Kind of thing, which is where the difference between rebirth and conquering death comes from. That's a really, really, really raw way of trying to describe this.
I think it's great. The abandonment of like a cycle, and that the cycle is broken, and so there's something. It's no longer that. It kind of spins itself out into a line. I learned that from Wade.
So that's exactly what you've just said is what Joshua and Clive represent in Final Fantasy XVI. Because Clive is really closely associated with Dionysus. Even when the game opens, it opens on a location called the Nysa Defile. Now, Mount Nysa is where Dionysus grew up, effectively. One of the nymphs that looked after him on Mount Nysa was called Ambrosia, which is also the name of Clive's chocobo, which most people will look at that and say, well, the chocobo is called Ambrosia, the Moogle's called Nectar, which was simply the food or the sustenance of the gods.
If you don't know, those are the birds that they ride in the game. It's like an ostrich.
So some of our audience does not play Final Fantasy, so the chocobos are big birds that they use as horses.
They ride ostriches. It's cool. Just roll with it. I will say I just got mine in Final Fantasy XIV.
14.
For those of you who know me, you'll believe I'm playing Final Fantasy 14, and I named my bird Prof. Bacchus.
Oh my god! I didn't know that.
Yep. So whenever I summon my mount, I say, "Come on, Prof. Bacchus, let's go." So Wade, you're always with me when I'm doing my adventures.
I'm so delighted.
Yeah.
MJ, going back to what you were saying for a second, as soon as Lost Wing, you really do pick up on all of these things from the Bennu, this cycle of rebirth, life and death, and the airship, and all of these Egyptian myths and all of this kind of stuff. These myths, for anybody that's read them and studied them, you find them pretty compelling, and you can see how they crafted cultures in the past. My question to you, though, is maybe a bit more of a meta sort of question, and it's one asking, it's just your opinion, right? Why do you think that the developers of Final Fantasy XVI are in some ways rebirthing these myths in a new medium? Why is it important to tell these stories for this generation through this medium?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to the comparative mythology aspect of there are universal myths. So there are tales that, the vast majority of humans are able to resonate with, irrespective of their circumstances, in time or geography or what. And one of the most important things about comparative mythologies is that this, again, across time, and we're not talking about, a couple of hundred years later. In some instances, we're talking about multiple millennia of difference in whole civilizations that have risen and fallen. But we can still see these continuous, or the same sort of archetypes, the same same themes that appear within all these myths, all these cultures all over the world. I think the important thing about that is because they are so universal. When you're looking at a game series like Final Fantasy, which historically, and certainly from Final Fantasy VII onwards, pre-Final Fantasy VII, a lot of the mythological elements that appeared were actually derived from Dungeons and Dragons. But the change with Final Fantasy VII was that the lead scenario writer, Kazushige Najima, actually had a background in creating video games about Greek mythology. So he took it one step further in Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy X, the Fabula Nova Crystallis.
That's the 13 compilation.
So when, from Final Fantasy VII onwards, while I think those who have studied mythology or those who studied religion are able to pick up on quite a number of instances, across the series over the last 25 years where there is very, very deliberate influence that has appeared within Final Fantasy, and I think what Final Fantasy XVI has done is recognise that and taken the sort of the universal myths, the comparative mythology, and used these stories, these universal truths, in a new way. I think that's what they've done, because as much as Business Unit 3, the Final Fantasy XIV is an absolute phenomenon, but to do with how it started before A Realm Reborn came into, also because its longevity and the number of writers that have come in and out and styles that have come and gone. It's not as coherent as a single title, a single release title like Final Fantasy XVI. So I think what they wanted to do was take their knowledge, their understanding, their love of Final Fantasy as a series, and then put the sort of the universal truths into one coherent story. That's my take on it. But
so I want one more question, and then I'd like for us to move on to some other topics. But this is a question that we ask in my class, and so if any of my students are listening, then
do your homework.
Bonus points, I guess, maybe, if you cite this in a paper. But
they're going to take you up on that.
They probably will.
You win.
Yeah, I'm done. One of the critiques that I sometimes hear, or complaints that I get, is why would we pay attention to myths? They're fake, right? Why is mythology something worth listening to today, even if it's in a video game that alludes to it? Why?
Well, I think mythology is just one way of telling stories, and it's one thing, and we quite often find this in our own lives, that the elders around us, or our parents, or an older brother or sister, or they'll quite often say that you have to experience it for yourself. No one can tell you how to feel. No one can tell you, how you're going to react to a certain thing. So if I had some profound wisdom that I wanted to share with you, I wouldn't outright just share directly what that wisdom was. I would have to find a way to actually make you understand and appreciate it for yourself, experience it for yourself. And quite often, when it comes to different mediums, that mythology is just one way of telling those stories. Nowadays we see it in movies, we see it in books. That you can find these pieces of wisdom that you might not otherwise have in your life, and you can understand the message of that with through a different medium. And I think that's just what mythology is. It's a way of giving you these profound truths without just outright stating what it is, and you have to experience this for yourself, sort of thing. Going back to the difference between mythos and logos that you and I have discussed many times.
Yeah. I think that you nailed it there, right? It's the idea of telling parables rather than just giving instructions. You want to help people feel the need or the urgency of the implication of the logos, right? You can just say the logos, but it's much stronger when it's founded in a myth or a mythos, right? Which is the story of 16, right? It's the culmination of all of these different myths becoming, I guess, inherent in Clive and Joshua particularly. Karen Armstrong, I don't know if you've ever read this book. It's a little bit more on religious history, I guess, but it's called The Case for God. And it's not an apologetics book, but it's more of like a history of theology and religion, inclusive of Egypt all the way to modern day. She describes and defines myth, and I'm kind of going off the top of my head. She defines myth as something that may or may not have been true at the time, but in some ways, it's true every time and for every time. And I think that that's always been a really guiding post for me in thinking about religion, mythology, and all this stuff. Where is truth? Because truth is greater than fact. And I think that we see that in the games that we play, the stories that we cherish. You yourself, I mean, if I could venture so far as to say one of your core mythos is Final Fantasy VII. It's part of your origin story, and it's made you who you are. And that speaks to the power of video games and video game narratives, that we can even say this was a formative thing that created MJ Gallagher, right?
Yeah.
Kind of a cool thing.
Absolutely. You know, I was raised as a Catholic, and I'm not a practicing Catholic or sort of invested in any sort of faith practicing at all nowadays. But I found that the manner in which I was taught growing up didn't resonate with me the way that the message of, you know, the Final Fantasy VII, one of the core messages is the process of grief. This idea of, you know, it's not just about life and death. It's about how you react to death. It's about acceptance. It's about coming to terms with loss and dealing with that in an appropriate way.
Yeah.
And that's not something that you can ever tell anyone. That's something that the closest you can get to having them understand that for themselves without, you know, actually experiencing it, is to do it through a story like Final Fantasy VII, to do it through a parable, to do it through a myth, to allow someone to understand the message that you're trying to get across over a period of time. And, you know, you would not feel the loss of Aerith had you not just spent 20 hours in her company, sort of thing, you know. But you wouldn't be able to do that with a film. You know, you could do it with a book, but of course, the Square Enix or Squaresoft are a video game company. But the point is, you know, without having to lose someone yourself, you can understand the message of what death is like, how people react to that. You know, how to process grief in an appropriate way. But you do it through this beautiful story that has monsters and aliens and, you know, a meteor coming to destroy the world, and more importantly, the live stream, which is a great way of, you know, really tapping into the idea of the collective unconscious and universal truths and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's I can't agree more with the idea that the importance of myths is that they allow us to you know, understand messages that we certainly couldn't understand or certainly appreciate if it was just, you know, directly articulated or an instruction, as you put it.
It's one of the things that I think I appreciated most, and I hear it in the way that you talk about this game. It's one of the things I appreciated most about Final Fantasy XVI. It reminds me of, though she is not necessarily a religious scholar, but therapist and psychologist Brené Brown once said that modern day religion exchanges the mystery of the divine and human existence for certainty, and that's a huge loss for us. And I feel as though that is something that 16 tackles. Those in the game that feel as though their icon or understanding of the dominance in icons is certain, well, they're the ones that are really missing out. But then at the end, you don't have necessarily a crumbling of these mythos, but you have the vivification, this revival of these through a greater mystery. And to me, that was the almost heartwarming piece of the end. You know, this isn't a spoiler cast or anything, but I hear these things from what you're doing. And honestly, the tidbits that you've given us today make me more excited about your book than ever. So it's so good.
Thank you.
We do want to shift gears in just a moment. We've got other things to talk about, especially some Final Fantasy VII stuff that I want to get into with you. But any closing comments about your experience of Final Fantasy XVI and Mythos?
Yeah, I absolutely adored Final Fantasy XVI. I would go as far as to say that it is behind Final Fantasy VII. It is my second favourite in the series, and while I do appreciate that it's not everyone's cup of tea, I think what I was looking for in the game was the mythology and or the theology as well, and what I hope to do is I think that because I was looking for that and because I understood the mythological references and the religious allusions, and I got so much out of the game that perhaps those unfamiliar with these fields, it was lost on them. And to me that's a great pity. So one of the purposes of this book is that I hope to share why I feel that Final Fantasy XVI is, as much as it does have its flaws, it is a masterpiece in storytelling.
Yeah.
And I hope to explain to those who missed out on that why it's a masterpiece. So I do hope that anyone who has an interest in the mythology or the religious allusions, or who's about to have their mind blown to bits by the Gnostic stuff, please do check out the book, because it will allow you to view Final Fantasy XVI through a completely different lens and hopefully enrich the experience for you retrospectively.
There you go. And for our listeners today, remember that you can be a part of the Kickstarter even right now. Check out the link in the comments. Make sure that you get your copy. You don't want to miss this one. It's going to be great.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so excited to be here. And unfortunately, we have a couple new perspectives for our crime scene that we've stumbled upon. An eyewitness account, if you will. Wade, I wonder if you could introduce this new perspective and just really help him contribute to the discussion that we've had already around these three crime scenes that we've experienced as we look at Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and why they chose to tell the story that way.
Eyewitness account from senior mythologist, resident author, MJ Gallagher. He was at the scene. And so we want to hear, MJ, how do you process the ending of Rebirth? Is it clear what's going on? Did you immediately know? What did you see, feel, and experience at the end of Rebirth?
Well, boys, it's looking like a bit of a mess. Actually,
Keep going. I loved it.
No, I loved it.
I had a fairly definitive picture in my mind once I saw the crime scene. It took me back to a personal experience that I had last year, where I know that in advance of witnessing the scene, I was uncertain what I was going to find. Was I going to find a dead body? Was I going to find something missing? Was I going to find no crime scene? But the experience that I had, and in terms of processing loss last year, was the confusion of grief, the inability to accept what was clearly presented in front of me. And even now, I've when I think back to the loss, and it quite simply just doesn't register. So, having been through that already, what my own experience taught me is that death is not something that you would necessarily react to immediately, not something that you would break down in tears. For some people, of course it is, but that's not how I reacted. My reaction was nothing. It was just, it simply was not registering this. And I feel that is exactly how Aerith's death was depicted in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. That Cloud, after a few moments of holding Aerith's body, tears rolling down his face, experiencing anger and then moving into a position where he just wasn't accepting what was going on. And I think the way that it's been presented is that there has almost been a split in fate where he is simultaneously experiencing two things, which is leading to, from a narrative perspective, it's actually leading to his confusion. But there's also the sort of the psychological side of it, where his trauma is in real time, stopping him from breaking, essentially. So what this does for the player is present us with an incomplete puzzle. So we're not 100% sure what Cloud is experiencing because he's not 100% sure what he's experiencing. Similarly, the characters around him are uncertain of what Cloud is doing, because the way that he is presenting himself is as if he is existing in a world where Aerith has not died, whereas everyone else is existing in a world where she has. So this sort of crossover where they think he is, almost sociopathic, because he is just not processing that grief. And to me, it was so familiar, not because I'm sociopathic or refusing to accept the death of a loved one, but because I just went about my day as if nothing had happened, because it was so horrible to try and come to terms with. And as a result of that, I don't believe that anything has actually changed from the original game. I think it's just the exploration of what's going on in Cloud's mind has been shown in a different way in order to lay the foundations of what will happen to Cloud when his mind does completely break, and the manner in which Sephiroth will manipulate those circumstances. So I actually, as much as I appreciate that the confusion took away the emotional aspect that people were hoping for, that they were, I think the problem wasn't that they wanted Aerith to live or Aerith to die. They just wanted to have an emotional reaction. But what the creative team did was remove that emotional reaction, and that has all that has left for a lot of people is anger. But again, for me personally, because I'd experienced something similar the year before, it was the perfect way to depict grief and a reaction to grief and a reaction to death. And actually in any medium, it is the best and most accurate way I've seen that reflected.
I don't know if I've heard it put quite as clearly as you just said, that this is such a strong depiction of the reality of grief and mourning in the moment. And I wonder if in 1997, one of the questions that we ask is, why are they telling the story this way? And my question is, in 1997, with text and with the advent of FMV and all this kind of stuff really coming into its place, could they have told the story quite in this way? And I'm not sure they could have, without it just being like wildly confusing. Just to be clear, though, you this was a loaded statement. I know a lot of people may disagree with you on this one. You think that it's pretty much going the same way as the original game?
I do.
Okay,
I think the for beat it's almost exactly the same. But I think because of how iconic Aerith's death was in the original game, there is no way to capture that shock again.
Yeah.
So what they had to do is capture and process grief in a different way. And I think that's exactly what they've done, and I applaud them for it, because I think it is a very, very real way that they have presented this.
Love it. Love it. So with that same thing, you think Aerith is dead. that Cloud's psyche is kind of fractured really quickly. What is going on with Zack? Because this stuff is pretty new in Rebirth, even though it's somewhat alluded to in the original. But what's going on with these different Zacks?
I personally don't believe that the other worlds are taking place in the live stream. I do genuinely believe they are physical locations. It seems to be an overlap, let's say dimension of the physical planet, because there seems to be multiple physical planes but only one live stream.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why the other worlds, the worlds that are coming to an end, the live stream seems to have been drained from them. And the best way that I can try and describe this is, I don't know if you're familiar with Philip Pullman's his Dark Materials.
Yes.
Saga. So one of the items that becomes available in that saga is called the Subtle Knife, where you're able to slice openings, or let's say portals, between the different layers of the worlds that coexist. So you are in the same physical space, but you can move between the planes of existence.
Interesting. Okay.
In the same physical space. And the knife allows you to do that, which, I think that's what's happening here. My personal mythological take on this is that the worlds themselves are branches of a tree, and the trunk of the tree is the main timeline. And every time there is a sort of branch that the fate is split, it will branch off, and then within those branches there will become sub branches that will then split off, and that's depicted in the scene with Zack in the train tunnel. Where effectively has three different options. He goes to, or he doesn't do anything and ends up sitting on the stairs outside the church, or he goes to the Shinra building, or he goes to get Biggs, and each of those are represented by a different stamp. But we then have, a main branch with sub branches, and the amount of tree symbolism and tree imagery and iconography that's going on through Rebirth, along with the high volume of references to Norse mythology, or Norse cosmology, of course, is represented by the world tree. I don't think it's a coincidence that I actually think that we are seeing parts of the world tree. Yeah.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And I can also tell that you and I have pretty similar origin stories as far as our interests. So stay tuned for some things coming out. That's really cool. I may have to call you after this call sometime to get your take on something. So great stuff. Well, we've continued looking through this crime scene. MJ, thank you so much. Your account has been incredibly insightful, and it's going to leave us thinking a little bit more. I could probably talk to you about this for days to come, but in the interest of time, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right, just as we kind of wrap things up and start to process thinking about the things that we're gaining in our lives before we jump straight into the games portion. MJ, thanks again for being here. What is it that kind of helps keep you grounded in life and in your professional career and in your personal life? What are those things that really help you stay grounded?
I have, first of all, I never ceases to amaze me that others are interested in my work, so I try to remain as grateful and as humble as I can. The second thing is that I always I have a real desire in this to create, and almost one of my favorite things in life is giving gifts or helping people or things like that. And I find that my creativity is almost like that. So it's almost like a release, and I treat my writing as a kind of therapy time, so that it helps me with my mental health. I make time for it every single day to sit down and have that outlet, and as a direct result of that, no matter what is going on in my day, just having that time, that being disciplined and allowing myself to sort of work in a creative fashion will sort of bring me back to equilibrium.
That's awesome. So
It's incredible.
The discipline is hard to develop, I imagine. And since you're a writer, I know that means that you are a bit of a reader then probably too. We're compiling a required reading list of video games to play for the listeners with all of our guests. And so if there were one or two titles that you would want to put on the required reading list, what would those be for people who are approaching games?
Wow. Weirdly enough, I don't tend to deviate too much from the Final Fantasy series. I do have, I kind of have a 9 to 5 job and I have young kids at home, and I work on my writing every single day, so I actually have a minimal time that allows me to game. And what time I do allow is almost exclusively Final Fantasy. So
Relatable.
my answer to that is two of the best games that I've ever played have been released over the last 12 or so months in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy XVI. So I guess that would have to be my really boring answer.
That's
But
great.
so good. They're all timers, so that's a great answer.
Okay, so for a little clarification, would you say that someone needs to play the original Final Fantasy VII before they have to play the remake and Rebirth to really appreciate it? Or would you say, you know what, just jump right in to remake and then go to Rebirth and just have a good time and look up everything else?
I personally wouldn't say that playing the original is required. I think it would help enrich the experience. Perhaps because, elements of the old game have not aged particularly well. Some parts have, some parts have not. But I think the story of Final Fantasy VII stands up on its own anyway, and whether or not you understand what's going on with the Whispers or the additional mysteries that have been added, I don't think that's particularly dependent on the original game. So I would say no, you don't have to play the original. And in fact, if you're new to Final Fantasy, I would probably encourage you not to. I would probably encourage you to start with Remake.
Okay, so start with Final Fantasy VII Remake if you've never played or approached anything. That's great. Well, another wonderful addition to our required reading list. In the midst of your busy schedule and taking good time with your family and your writing, we just want to say thank you so much again for taking the time to be with us. We know that you probably gave up your gaming time to come here and do this interview with us, and so we are just so appreciative. It was so nice to meet you, and I really had a great time listening and learning from you.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here, and thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. So where can people find you?
The best place to get me on social media is probably through X or Twitter, just at FFVII Novels. I'm also producing content for KupoCon, so it'll be on KupoCon's channel on YouTube, which is just KupoCon. I think it's KupoCon EN, but
we'll look it up and put it in there.
We'll tag them in the notes. Yeah,
I'm currently working through a Final Fantasy VII Rebirth breakdown series. I'm just sort of pointing out all the hidden details that individuals who are perhaps not as familiar with the compilation or the background content may have missed first time around. I have my entire back catalogue of works is available on my Patreon account. Most of it is just free to check out, it's just www.patreon.com/MJ Gallagher. And my existing mythology books, Norse myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII and Greek myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII, are both available on Amazon, just around the world if you are interested in checking those out. And finally, until the 4th of August, my Kickstarter for Mythos Final Fantasy XVI is live. So if you are interested in finding out more about that, please do give us a visit on Kickstarter.
Fantastic. And all those links are in our show notes, so be sure and check them out. MJ, thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you.
Absolute delight.
My pleasure.
What a great time. Thanks to MJ Gallagher again for the interview. Another thanks to Sing 40 Laughter for the use of the music on this episode. We really appreciate it. And thanks to Nick Smith for doing our graphics. We appreciate all of you tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next episode. Thanks.